It's 6:59. I think we can start now. My name is Michelle Sweeten. I am the Eastern UP forage and livestock educator. And today, I've got some interesting things that have happened overnight for you. And I would like to introduce you to Dr. Brook Wilke. He's going to talk about cover crops after wheat, and I will let him share his screen and he can get started this morning.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, great news for many of you that probably got some good rain overnight, except for maybe those of you that are trying to get wheat harvested. But I think, like most of us, we'd probably prefer to have the rain and delay wheat a little bit than not. So that is great news for a lot of us in the middle of the state. Hopefully nobody got too much. I'm here to talk about cover crop options after wheat, and this is an important topic because the window after wheat is a great opportunity for us to really work on improving soil health and getting other benefits from cover crops that we don't have with most of our other crops. And so it's important to take advantage of that window if we can, because if we don't and we leave it fallow, we can actually go backwards. So it's kind of especially in terms of soil health. So it's an important window to consider how we want to utilize for overall improvement of our soil. So I'm going to try to give you some real options to think about and so forth. But before we get too far into that, I did want to address sort of an elephant in the room that this year, cover crops in the spring with a really dry May and June in most parts of the state presented some really unique challenges. So before we get to what should we plant after wheat, let's think about what the end result is going to be before we get to spring 2024, just so we're prepared. So as you all know, May was wet early and then hot and dry. And we had a really narrow window to plant. And cover crops, while it was wet in April and early May, probably helped some of us get into the field. But then very quickly, when it got dry, cover crops sort of exacerbated the dry conditions because they're moving soil moisture out into the atmosphere and making planting potentially more challenging. And crops like soybeans can be a little bit more tough in those planting conditions, but corn and dry beans are particularly sensitive to dry soil. And so cover crops definitely add a bit of challenge to that. But I also want to tell you how we can still have cover crops and it's not the end of the world. I don't want everybody to be scared of having overwintering cover crops just because of this dry year. I show this picture here of a field that we burnt down with a heavy cover crop in early May, and then we planted corn into it. And a few weeks later, the corn was there because we got cover crops, or we had cover crops there. There was some moisture when we planted corn, but then we didn't get any rain afterwards for weeks. And the corn came up, but it just sat there idle for a long time. And I was scared. I was really scared. I thought it was going to fail. This is one of our major experiments. But we gave it a few more weeks, and that corn, I tell you what, those crops are so tough. So the lesson is that if you can get the crops established and started, they can take a lot of just waiting while that cover crop residue is there, the crops are established. They can wait it out in many cases. But the critical point is getting the crop seed into moisture in conjunction with that cover crop residue, however you terminated it, so that it can get established and started. Now, when we're thinking about trying to minimize the risk of having cover crops make our spring soil moisture conditions worse, here's some options. Think about planting cover crops that winter kill, that you don't have to worry about them taking moisture in the spring, which doesn't help if we're trying to remove extra moisture, of course. And there are some options to think about planting winter kill cover crops just in rows, like I have the radishes here in rows, that only go where your cash crop is going to be. And that way in the spring, maybe you have a different cover crop in between the cash crop rows, but you have a winter kill cover crop in the cash crop rows so that you preserve that moisture in that band. We can also think about terminating cover crops in April or early May before they get too big, such as the picture that I have with the tractor driving through the field here of annual ryegrass. being terminated pretty young. It doesn't have much chance to really grow very, very big and reduce soil moisture. We definitely want to avoid, if we get to that dry window and we have cover crops, if we use tillage at that point, it's just going to make everything a lot worse. In some cases, we have to use tillage, but if we can avoid it when we get into that scenario, avoiding tillage and eliminating the last remaining moisture we have. And then, of course, using good planting equipment to cut through the cover crop residue and so forth is really critical. Down pressure, row cleaners, closing wheels are all really important in managing planting in and around cover crops in the spring. Here's a quick video I have of us planting corn into this cover crop residue. I realize many of you may not be able to see it, but this planter is equipped with all those things I mentioned: row cleaners, down pressure systems, row cleaners that have spiked, closing wheels that have spiked teeth to help get the crop planted into pretty tough conditions. Okay, so just wanted to make sure we covered that because it is a challenge. We have to recognize it's a challenge when you have tough weather conditions in the spring, especially dry, but we are able to overcome that if we're smart and make decisions appropriately. I also wanted to talk about what cover crops we can plant after wheat and how much they cost and how much you should seed. So let's start with legumes. When using legumes, we can grow some of our own nitrogen for the next crop. And so that's a real big asset. Here's some different cover crops that we can plant. Hairy vetch is a picture on the right. Sun hemp is the picture on the left with the yellow flower. These cover crops can range in cost from anywhere from about $27 per acre up to $60 or more if you want to use more seed. But you can kind of see the range that they might cost you if you use the seeding rates that are standard for that type of crop. Okay. Clover, either red clover or crimson clover, can be planted after wheat still and can still contribute quite a bit of nitrogen. All of these, you're going to want to consider a rhizobial inoculant so that you have the bacteria that you need to work with that plant to fix nitrogen. Other cover crops or legumes that you might consider include just soybeans. Any kind of soybean could work. Cowpeas, faba beans, common vetch, peas. There's a bunch of options, but the top four on the list really are my favorites and how they perform in our part of southern Michigan. When we're thinking about how much nitrogen can we get from these legume cover crops, really it ranges and varies depending on a lot of different factors. What species did you grow? How much did you let it grow? How much biomass did you accumulate? How did you terminate it? Did you till it in? Did you no-till kill it? Was it mixed with another species? That all varies, but most calculations predict that you can get anywhere from 0 to 100 pounds of plant available nitrogen for the next crop. And I put I think they got into the chat, a really nice link to a way, I think it was Oregon State University did this publication on how to estimate the amount of nitrogen you might get from your legume cover crops. 100 pounds is a lot. That would be, a rare case of having a really great cover crop. In many cases, if you have a good clover cover crop, for example, you might be crediting 50 to 60 pounds, right? Especially if it's kind of in your first year of cover cropping. As you get further down the road of cover cropping, you might build up more of a bank in your soil that you might be able to lean heavier into those higher credits. Other cover crop options, we've got various options. Old standbys like oats and radish would cost you, and I want to point out, a lot of these don't have to cost a lot of money. I got a picture of oats and radish here in the middle. $20 an acre, you can get a really great cover crop that will winter kill. Other brassicas like mustards, rapeseeds are really great options after wheat, especially for most of the crops that we would be following with. I know a lot of people like to grow radish ahead of sugar beets. but they can be really cheap, especially dwarf Essex rape. You can plant that for as little as $5 to $7 per acre. If you want to grow a lot of biomass, sorghum sudan, pearl millet, or other types of sorghums can be really productive. And you can plant that for fairly inexpensively too, especially if you seek out and choose the cover crop varieties. The cost of these different varieties of these sorghum sedans can vary a lot. So specifically ask for the cover crop variety to save on the cost, especially if you aren't that concerned about forage or something like that. Buckwheat, sunflowers, both are really great for producing flowers that can be beautiful on your landscape or attract pollinators. If you're thinking about grasses, several things to consider. Well, number one, don't forget you're going to have volunteer wheat in your field. I am sure nobody is perfect at getting every last wheat seed coming out of the combine. So you're going to have some volunteer wheat. But then if you want to go with a grass cover crop instead of these others that I mentioned, annual ryegrass is a pretty good option that can be sort of versatile ahead of a lot of different crops, including corn. We tend to see a little bit less problem with corn following annual ryegrass, and it's pretty cheap. You can grow it for $12 to $15 per acre. But annual ryegrass does not do well with tillage in the spring. It kind of comes up in clumps and is really hard to break down. And so it's really best in no-till situations. Oats are a great option. They'll winter kill. They're pretty cheap, $20 per acre. You can probably get a decent oat seeding, or the variety of other winter cereals like rye, wheat, barley, triticale. All of those can do well. Most of them, except for spring barley, will overwinter. And any of these grass crops, you don't need to plant as much seed as you would in the fall when you're planting it after wheat in July or August, because they have so much more time to tiller. And so 50 pounds, a bag of seed for most of these, except for annual ryegrass, you don't want to plant that much, but for the other cereals, 50 pounds is plenty adequate. And generally, when you're planting cover crops, there's recommended rates for all the cover crops, but you don't need to plant the highest rate. Sometimes just getting a plant out there is most important, and a seeding rate of half of what's recommended will produce more biomass than more than half the biomass of the full seeding rate. And so if you're looking to save money and whatnot, consider, cutting back the rate and still getting something out there. All cover crops after wheat need to be planted into the soil. Surface spreading just doesn't work this time of the year. It's too dry and hot, and usually we don't get good success just dropping seed on the surface, although it's possible, but unlikely. And then if you've got cattle in your system or other livestock, or you've got neighbors, consider using the cover crop as feed for the cattle. It's a great way to add value to the cover crop, and typically we don't see any negative to like soil health if we're feeding the cover crop to cattle, especially if we graze. So consider using that as an asset. And then my last thought here is cover crop mixtures, and sometimes these get thrown out quite a bit and talked about, cocktails and so forth. And I guess my thoughts on this are mixtures are great. You have the opportunity to be creative with your cover crop, but I would suggest don't overthink it. One of the things that we do at our research station is we just use up all the old seed that we have, and we have a lot of different cover crop seeds laying around. So we just use up old seed, mix it together, and throw it out there. Sometimes even corn gets in that mix, and it looks kind of funny, but it's hard to do much harm in this, right? You can reduce the seed rates proportionally to how many different species you have in the mix. And you might want to think about having different plant types like grasses, legumes, some winter kill, some overwintering, and so forth. But it's an opportunity to be creative and just throw some stuff out there and see what happens. And you might have a chance to evaluate what you might like. Now, you can overthink it and potentially strategize a little bit more. And one of the scenarios would be if you want to plant cover crop species specifically in rows where you're going to plant your cash crop. An example might be if we're planting corn or sugar beets, maybe we do want a cover crop that's going to winter kill in the rows of those crops, like radish or oats. And then between the rows of where we're going to plant the cash crop, maybe we'll grow a legume like clover, vetch, something like that, that won't compete as much with the seed when we plant it. It'd be easier to terminate between the rows. So you can think about doing things like that if you really want to optimize how we use different cover crops. I don't know if there's any prescription for best way to do that, but we have the opportunity to be creative as we do that. So that's what I've got for you this morning. I'm happy to answer any questions. I can look up other seed costs if you want in the meantime, or any other questions about this. So I'd be happy to talk more in the chat or live, but at this point, I'll turn it back over.
And I am going to get to questions and answers. All right, so our first question came in pretty early. Will radish kill slugs?
Lots of great questions pouring in, so thanks everybody. And Chris, I hope you're here to maybe chime in on this one too. So I know that radishes or slugs like to eat radishes, but there is a little bit of evidence floating around that maybe radishes that have high sulfate concentrations might cause slugs to have some issues, but I don't know personally if that really can play out in a field setting. Do you know, Chris?
No, I don't. There was a thing online that said that if the slugs eat radish, gas will build up in their system and their lungs will explode. But of course, they don't have lungs, which makes me think that that source was not particularly credible. So
yeah,
that I don't know.
Let's go with probably not. Probably won't really help the slug situation, but we don't really know yet. Maybe if any
cover crops,
there could be some effect, but as I'm looking online, I see it's all over the board. People say they eat radishes. People say they don't eat radish. So I don't know what to make of that.
They do like to eat brassicas. I know that. They can do a lot of damage to brassica seedlings. So, yeah, don't count on it.
Our next question is, if you get enough biomass with winter killed mixes, are you seeing any weed control of spring annuals?
Come on.
Okay, so cover crops, especially like radishes and oats, can have really great weed control properties, especially for winter annual weeds, like chickweeds, henbit, those types of winter annuals that show up. If you grow, a heavy radish crop, you will see almost none of those coming up in the spring. But then weeds that emerge starting in the spring, I haven't necessarily noticed any additional benefits to that, if you have spring emerging weeds. So I would just count on the fall emerging weeds to be suppressed by those winter killed cover crops. They do help with that.
Good. Okay, what are your thoughts on Sudan grass on suppression of thistle? I've read this has some effect on reducing thistle population. Would you have enough growth after wheat to have this effect?
So Sudan grass or sorghum Sudan, both are great. Probably our best option if we're trying to smother some of those weeds that are really problematic summer, either perennial weeds or some annual weeds, because they grow a lot. So yes, those crops, if you get them planted early, and the trick with those is you have to get them planted as soon as you can after wheat, because that late July and August window are really the critical growing periods. But if you get them planted soon after wheat harvest, they can grow. I've seen sorghum Sudan grow to be 10 feet tall or more in that window. And so you can get a lot of growth. The key probably is to control the weeds at the start. So if you've got some thistle or maybe quackgrass or other problematic perennial weeds, try to get them controlled when you plant the sorghum Sudan or the Sudan. And that way it's starting from the ground. And then it wouldn't also hurt to probably try to get a little bit of nitrogen out there to encourage that growth of the sorghum Sudan if you can as well. And also don't be afraid to mow it if you need to later on, because it can get really big, but definitely great options for controlling weeds for sure.
All right. Scott had a comment about planting oats. He said planting oats early in late July and early August with a warm fall, they will head out. I like to wait till the last week in August or the first week in September. By then you can round up weeds like thistles and volunteer wheat before planting the oats. So you have a cleaner field the next year.
Yes, that's a great thought, Scott. And a good note to point out that some of these cover crops you don't need to plant right away. It depends on your goals. If you're looking to get a lot of biomass, let's say if you're trying to grow cattle feed or something like that, get it planted early, get it growing. But if
Brooke, we've lost you.
Yeah, she twisted. More.
I got muted. Definitely those cooler season crops you can wait, and absolutely, like you said, that's a great thought. You don't have to, if you're growing cover crops, you don't have to achieve like huge biomass numbers to hit every target, right? So it's a great idea, and great way to put this into practice.
All right. So Steven says he's harvesting wheat soon and planting the same again in September. Can we plant a winter kill biomass cover crop and seed the new crop into the cover crop? Or will we need to terminate the cover crop before planting the new wheat seed?
So I've played around with this a little bit, not so much with wheat, but with canola and sorghum Sudan. So planting sorghum Sudan after the wheat comes off and then mowing it right before planting winter canola in September, and then seeing what happens, because we know the sorghum Sudan is going to winter kill. And it definitely did not. So the canola grew, but it was definitely affected by having the regrowth of that cover crop that was still growing until frost, in mid-October. And so if you're trying to optimize your wheat crop that you're going to be planting that fall, I would say probably in most cases, you're going to have some yield loss by letting the cover crop winter kill and sort of grow with, the cash crop that you've got planted. And so it's a little risky, I would say. And unless you can figure out a way to mow the cover crop and get it killed at that time of the wheat planting via mowing. But without that, I would be a little concerned. Maybe something like buckwheat you could do that with, but it would take some experience in that situation to try to fine tune that to get it just right, I think.
Okay. Our next comment was John said he had just under 4 inches of rain south of Belding, and I think Phil said he had about the same. Monica Jean did post the Midwest cover crops. There's a wheat PDF there in the, if anybody needs that. Eric reminded us that there's a tillage field day on August 8th at MSU Mason Small Grains Research Farm. And all that information is in the chat as well.
Michelle, I did have a question that was in early. Associated with planting oilseed radish as a trap crop for sugar beets. Can you also plant sorghum Sudan grass along with the radish to have a 2-for-1 to get a forage crop along with the trap crop?
Yeah, that's a great question, Phil. And I know some people are thinking about that dual use, because the way this works, the radish ahead of the sugar beets sort of confuses those nematodes, and they try to colonize the radish and they're not successful at reproducing. And so you end up reducing the populations, which is a great asset. And I don't work in sugar beets directly, so I don't have any direct experience, but my understanding is that as long as you have the radishes out there in enough concentration and enough of them, that they will serve the purpose regardless of what else you have in the field. And so it becomes a balance of trying to make sure that the radishes have enough space and so forth to grow and do their job. Mixing it with a crop like sorghum Sudan can be tricky, because sorghum Sudan will outcompete the radishes if you have too much of it in the mixture. because it is so aggressive. And so you'd want to be strategic. This might be a case where you want to think about rows of cover crops, where you put the radish in the rows where you're going to plant the sugar beets and the sorghum sudan between the rows. If you have a drill that you can split in some way, to try to make sure that you give the radish enough space to grow. That would be my primary concern.
Thank you, Phil, for bringing that one up.
Michelle, I'm going to say that if we don't have any other questions, I think we can go ahead and wrap it up for this morning. We'll give everybody just a few more minutes of their day back so that they can go clear water out of their standing water out of their fields or something. I don't know. So,
Well, some of us are going to be making hay, Phil, so it's it stayed dry up north, but
okay.
I'm glad you got rain down south.
Well, with that, everyone, thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and end this session of Virtual Breakfast. Have a great week, and we'll see you again next time.